The summer heat in Wichita Falls was downright unforgiving in 1957, the kind that made asphalt soft underfoot and had folks seeking shade wherever they could find it. It was into this world that Gregory Wayne Abbott was born on November 13th. To Calvin and Doris Abbott, good, church-going folks who believed in hard work, personal responsibility, and the good Lord's plan for every soul. "Now, Greg, you listen here," Calvin would say, adjusting his work boots on the front porch after another long day at the oil refinery. The cicadas were singing their evening song, and young Greg sat cross-legged on the wooden planks hanging on every word. This great state of Texas wasn't built by folks waiting for handouts. It was built by people who understood that freedom ain't free, and that with God's blessing comes the responsibility to stand up for what's right. Doris would nod from her rocking chair, her Bible never far from reach. "Your daddy's right, honey. The Lord gives us challenges not to break us, but to make us stronger. Remember that, Greg." The Abbott household was one where Sunday morning church wasn't optional, where the Pledge of Allegiance was recited with genuine reverence, and where political discussions around the dinner table weren't just encouraged, they were expected. Young Greg absorbed it all like a sponge, developing an early appreciation for the intersection of faith, politics, and Texas identity. By high school, Greg had already shown signs of the sharp legal mind that would define his career. He wasn't the biggest kid on the football team, but he was strategic, always thinking 3 plays ahead. His debate teacher, Mrs. Henderson, often remarked to other faculty, "That Abbott boy's got something special. He doesn't just argue. He builds cases like he's already in a courtroom." "Well, Mrs. Henderson," Greg would say with that characteristic slight smile, "I reckon if you're gonna make a point, you better make it stick. My daddy always says, don't just talk the talk if you ain't prepared to walk the walk." The values instilled in those formative years in North Texas would prove to be the bedrock of everything that followed: family, faith, and an unwavering belief in the Texas way of life. These weren't just concepts to young Abbott, they were articles of faith that would guide every major decision of his life. Hey, before we continue, let me ask you, have you liked and subscribed to the channel yet? No? Then take advantage now and click the subscribe button below, and leave a comment with what you think of this video and which city you're watching it from. Your participation is very important to us. It helps our channel grow and bring more content like this. I'm counting on you. Now, let's continue. Austin in the late 1970s was a city caught between its laid-back college town roots and its emerging role as Texas's political powerhouse. Greg Abbott arrived at the University of Texas with a clear sense of purpose that set him apart from many of his peers who were still figuring out their path. Y'all might think law school's just about memorizing cases and learning to argue. Greg would tell his study group during those long nights in the library, but I'll tell you what it really is. It's about understanding that the Constitution isn't just some old piece of paper. It's the foundation of everything we hold dear as Americans. His roommate, Jake Morrison, remembered those conversations well. Greg wasn't like the other guys. While we were debating who was going to win the Cotton Bowl, he was reading Federalist papers for fun. He'd say, "Jake, you can't defend something if you don't understand what you're defending." Professor Williams, who taught constitutional law, quickly took notice of Abbott's unique perspective. "Mr. Abbott," he said after class 1, particularly heated discussion about federal versus state authority, "you argue these points like they're personal to you." "Well, Professor," Greg replied, that familiar Texas drawl carrying a weight beyond his years, "I reckon they are personal. Every time the federal government oversteps its bounds, it's not just violating the Constitution, it's violating the trust of folks back home who believe in limited government and personal freedom." It was during his time at UT that Abbott began to understand how the law could be wielded as both shield and sword in defense of conservative principles. He wasn't just studying case law, he was learning how to craft legal strategies that could protect the values he'd grown up with. His girlfriend at the time, Sarah Beth, would later recall, Greg had this way of explaining complex legal concepts by relating them back to everyday life in Texas. He'd say, if a man can't protect his property, worship as he sees fit, and raise his children according to his values. Then what's the point of having a constitution at all? After graduating from law school in 1984, Abbott didn't head to some big city firm. Instead, he returned to his roots, setting up practice in Houston and later moving to Austin. He specialized in cases that aligned with his deeply held beliefs: property rights, religious freedom, and constitutional challenges to federal overreach. "I didn't become a lawyer to get rich," he would tell anyone who asked about his career choices. "I became a lawyer because I believe the law should protect the God-fearing, hardworking people who make this country great. And if that means taking on the federal government when they step out of line, well, that's just what needs doing." July 14th, 1984, started like any other summer day in Houston. The humidity was thick enough to cut with a knife, and the afternoon thunderstorms were building on the horizon. 26-year-old Greg Abbott had been out for his regular jog through River Oaks, a routine that helped him clear his mind after long days building his legal practice. "It's funny how life can change in the span of a heartbeat," Abbott would later reflect. "One second you're running along, thinking about a case you're working on, and the next, the massive oak tree weakened by recent storms and heavy with waterlogged branches chose that moment to surrender to gravity. The crushing impact left Greg pinned beneath its enormous trunk, his spine severed at the T12 level dot at Herman Hospital. Dr. Patricia Rodriguez delivered the news that would reshape everything. "Mr. Abbott, I'm going to be straight with you because that's what you deserve. The damage to your spinal cord is severe. You're not going to walk again." The silence in that sterile room was deafening. Greg's parents sat beside his bed, his mother clutching her ever-present Bible, his father's weathered hands clasped so tight his knuckles had gone white. Finally, Greg spoke, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Doc, I appreciate you being direct. Now, what I need to know is this: is my mind still sharp? Can I still think? Still argue? Still fight for what I believe in?" Dr. Rodriguez was taken aback by the question. "Well, yes, Mr. Abbott. Cognitively, you're completely unaffected. Then we'll figure out the rest," Greg said simply. "The good Lord doesn't give us more than we can handle. And he sure didn't put me through law school just to quit at the first real challenge." The months of rehabilitation were grueling, but they revealed the true measure of Abbott's character. Physical therapist Maria Santos worked with him daily and witnessed his transformation. Most people in his situation go through stages of grief, anger, depression. Not Greg. He approached his recovery like he was preparing for the biggest case of his life, Maria. Greg would say during particularly difficult sessions, sweat beading on his forehead as he worked to master his wheelchair, "My daddy always told me that it ain't what happens to you that defines you. It's how you respond to what happens to you. This accident doesn't change who I am or what I believe in. If anything, it's gonna make me fight harder for folks who need someone in their corner." 6 months after the accident, Abbott was back in court, appearing before Judge Hamilton in a property rights case. The opposing counsel, thinking they could exploit what they perceived as weakness, quickly learned otherwise. "Your Honor," Abbott argued from his wheelchair, his voice carrying the same commanding presence it always had, "the fact that I'm sitting instead of standing doesn't change the law one bit. Property rights are property rights, whether you're on 2 feet or 2 wheels." Judge Hamilton later commented, "I've seen a lot of lawyers in my courtroom, but I've never seen someone turn personal adversity into such professional strength." Abbott didn't just overcome his accident, he used it to become a better advocate. The settlement Abbott eventually reached with the tree service company and property owner, reported to be in the millions, would provide financial security. But more importantly, the experience crystallized his understanding of resilience, faith, and the power of refusing to be defined by circumstances beyond one's control. "That tree took my legs," Abbott would tell supporters years later, "but it couldn't touch my convictions. And sometimes, the Lord works in mysterious ways. Maybe I needed to understand what it meant to fight from a different position before I could truly fight for all Texans." By 1992, Greg Abbott had established himself as one of Austin's most formidable attorneys, specializing in cases that defended conservative principles against what he saw as federal overreach. His reputation for meticulous preparation and unwavering Conviction had caught the attention of Governor and Richards, who, despite their political differences, recognized legal talent when she saw it. "Now, Greg, I know we don't see eye to eye on much," Governor Richards said during their meeting in the Capitol, her distinctive silver hair catching the afternoon light, streaming through the tall windows. "But the folks I trust tell me you're one hell of a lawyer, and that's what the Texas Supreme Court needs." Abbott leaned forward in his wheelchair, his hands folded precisely. "Governor, I appreciate the consideration, but I need you to understand something. If you appoint me to that court, I'm going to interpret the law based on what the Constitution says, not what's politically convenient. I'm going to defend property rights, religious liberty, and the principle that government closest to the people governs best." Richards chuckled. "Son, I wouldn't expect anything less from you. That's exactly why you're right for the job." The appointment to the Texas Supreme Court at age 34 marked a turning point in Abbott's career. Justice Abbott, as he was now known, brought a methodical approach to constitutional interpretation that would define his judicial philosophy for years to come. His first major case involved a dispute over eminent domain in East Texas, where the state was attempting to seize private property for a highway expansion. During oral arguments, Abbott's questioning was sharp and purposeful. "Counsel," Abbott addressed the state's attorney, "you're asking this court to believe that the public good justifies taking a man's family farm that's been in his family for generations. Where exactly in the Constitution does it say that convenience trumps property rights?" The opposing attorney stumbled through his response, but Abbott wasn't finished. "The Founding Fathers understood that property rights are fundamental to liberty itself. When government can take what's yours simply because they want it, then none of us truly own anything." His colleague, Justice Maria Gonzalez, would later observe, "Greg didn't just rule on cases, he crafted opinions that became teaching moments about constitutional principles. He understood that every decision from that bench had the potential to either strengthen or weaken the foundations of our republic." The farm case became known as Abbott's first major victory for property rights, establishing precedent that would protect Texas landowners for decades. But it was his approach to religious liberty cases that really began to set him apart. In 1995, a case came before the court involving a small Baptist church in Lubbock that was being forced to remove a cross from their property due to zoning restrictions. Abbott's opinion was both legally sound and passionate. "This court will not stand idly by while local bureaucrats trample on the First Amendment," he wrote. "Religious expression is not a privilege granted by government, it's a right endowed by our Creator and protected by our Constitution. The cross stays." Word of Abbott's judicial philosophy spread quickly through conservative legal circles. Professor James Mitchell at Baylor Law School assigned Abbott's opinions to his students. "Class, what you see in Justice Abbott's work is something rare. In modern jurisprudence, a judge who believes the Constitution means what it says, not what contemporary politics wishes it said." By 1998, Abbott had authored over 100 opinions, each one building his reputation as a defender of constitutional originalism. His chambers became a destination for law clerks who wanted to learn how to craft legally bulletproof arguments for conservative principles. Judge Abbott taught us that every word in a legal opinion matters. Recalled former clerk David Chen, he'd say, "We're not just settling this case, we're setting precedent that will guide Texas law for generations. That's a responsibility we can't take lightly." The judge's personal story also resonated with Texans. Here was a man who had faced personal tragedy and turned it into professional triumph, who never used his disability as an excuse, but rather as motivation to work harder for the people of Texas. At the annual Texas Bar Association dinner in 1999, Abbott delivered a speech that would be remembered as a defining moment in his judicial career. "My fellow Texans, the law is not a living, breathing document that changes with the political winds. It's the bedrock upon which our freedoms rest, and as long as I have the privilege of serving on this court, I will defend that bedrock with everything I have." The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes, and more than one observer noted that Abbott looked less like a judge and more like a future political leader. The year 2002 marked a pivotal moment in Texas politics, and Greg Abbott sensed the winds of change blowing across the Lone Star State. After nearly a decade on the Texas Supreme Court, he had built an unassailable reputation as a constitutional scholar and conservative champion. Now, the Attorney General's office beckoned, a position that would allow him to take his fight for conservative principles from the courtroom to the national stage. Folks, I'm running for Attorney General because Texas needs someone who understands that our state's rights aren't suggestions, they're guarantees written in the Constitution. Abbott declared at his campaign kickoff in Austin. The crowd of supporters, many wearing cowboy hats and "Don't Mess with Texas" t-shirts, erupted in cheers. Campaign manager Sarah Williams watched from the side of the stage. Impressed by Abbott's natural ability to connect with voters, Greg had this way of making complex constitutional issues feel personal, she later recalled. He wasn't just talking about legal precedent, he was talking about protecting the Texas way of life. Abbott's Democratic opponent, Kirk Watson, was a formidable candidate with strong name recognition. But Abbott's message of federalism and constitutional principles resonated deeply with Texas voters who felt increasingly frustrated with Washington's overreach. "Let me tell you something about Greg Abbott," said rancher Billy Joe McKinnon at a campaign event in Amarillo, his weathered hands gripping the podium. "That man understands that we didn't join the Union to be told how to live by a bunch of bureaucrats who've never set foot in Texas. He's gonna fight for us." The campaign was hard fought, but Abbott's victory in November 2002 was decisive. He won by nearly 20 percentage points, carrying to 140 of Texas's to 150 for counties. His victory speech that night set the tone for what would become 12 years of aggressive constitutional warfare. Tonight, the people of Texas have sent a clear message to Washington: don't mess with Texas, and don't mess with the Constitution, Abbott declared to thunderous applause. "As your Attorney General, I will sue the federal government every time they step outside their constitutional bounds. That's not a threat, that's a promise." He kept that promise from day one. Within his first year in office, Abbott had already filed 3 major lawsuits against federal agencies, challenging everything from environmental regulations to healthcare mandates. His legal team, led by Chief Deputy James Ho, became known as the most aggressive state-level legal operation in the country. The Attorney General's office under Abbott wasn't just reactive, it was proactive, explained constitutional law professor Rebecca Martinez. They weren't waiting for federal overreach to happen. They were anticipating it and preparing their legal strategies in advance. Abbott's first major victory came in 2004 with a case challenging EPA regulations that would have shut down several Texas refineries. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals sided with Texas, ruling that the federal government had exceeded its authority under the Clean Air Act. This victory isn't just about Texas. It's about the principle that states have rights that the federal government must respect, Abbott said at a press conference following the ruling. "We proved that David can still beat Goliath when David has the Constitution on his side." But it was Abbott's handling of religious liberty cases that really began to define his national profile. When the ACLU challenged displays of the 10 Commandments on government property, Abbott didn't just defend them, he made them a crusade. At the Texas State Capitol, standing before the granite monument of the 10 Commandments, Abbott delivered one of his most memorable speeches. "These commandments aren't just historical artifacts, they're the moral foundation upon which our laws are built. The First Amendment doesn't require us to scrub our public spaces clean of religious expression. It requires government to protect that expression." The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where Abbott personally argued Texas's position. In a 5-4 decision, the court sided with Texas, allowing the monument to remain. Abbott's victory was seen as a watershed moment for religious liberty advocates nationwide. Greg Abbott didn't just win legal cases, he won hearts and minds, observed political analyst Tom Phillips. He understood that each victory was an opportunity to educate the public about constitutional principles and build support for conservative governance. By 2010, Abbott had filed over 30 lawsuits against the Obama administration, challenging everything from healthcare mandates to immigration enforcement. His lawsuit against the Affordable Care Act, joined by 25 other states, became the most significant. constitutional challenge to federal power in decades. Some folks in Washington think they can force Texans to buy health insurance, whether we want it or not, Abbott said during a rally in Dallas. Well, I've got news for them. The Constitution doesn't give the federal government that power, and Texas will not comply with unconstitutional mandates. Though the Supreme Court ultimately upheld the ACA, Abbott's leadership in the legal challenge established him as the de facto leader of the conservative legal resistance. Attorneys general from across the country began looking to Texas for guidance on how to fight federal overreach. Abbott turned the Texas Attorney General's office into the constitutional conscience of America, said former Reagan administration official Ed Mace. He showed other states that you don't have to accept federal overreach, you can fight it and win. As 2014 approached and speculation about the governor's race intensified, Abbott had transformed himself from a respected judge into a national conservative hero. His 12 years as Attorney General had been a masterclass in using the law to defend conservative principles, and Texas voters were ready to promote him to higher office. The spring of 2013 brought unseasonably warm weather to Austin, and with it, the buzz of political speculation that had become as predictable as the Texas heat. Governor Rick Perry's announcement that he wouldn't seek re-election had set off a cascade of political maneuvering. But one name rose above all others in conservative circles: Greg Abbott. "Y'all, I've been thinking about this decision for months," Abbott confided to his wife Cecilia during one of their evening walks around their Austin neighborhood. 12 years as AG has been fulfilling, but I keep feeling like the Lord's calling me to something bigger. Texas needs leadership that won't bend to federal pressure or compromise on our values. Cecilia, herself a former teacher and judge, understood the weight of the decision. "Greg, you've never backed down from a fight when principles were at stake. If you think you can do more good as governor, then that's what you should do." Abbott's formal announcement came on July 14, 2013, exactly 29 years to the day after his life-changing accident. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present at the rally in San Antonio. "Folks, 29 years ago today, I learned that life can change in an instant," Abbott began, his voice carrying across the crowd of 2,000 supporters. "But I also learned that what defines us isn't what happens to us, it's how we respond. Today, I'm responding to the call to serve Texas as your next governor." The crowd erupted. But Abbott wasn't finished. "Washington politicians think they can tell Texans how to live, what to believe, and how to run our state. Well, I've got a message for them. We are Texas. We bow to no one but Almighty God, and we will govern ourselves according to the Constitution our founders gave us." Abbott's primary campaign was unlike anything Texas had seen before. Drawing on his network of conservative legal scholars, business leaders, and grassroots activists built during his tenure as Attorney General, he assembled a political machine that combined old-school Texas retail politics with cutting-edge digital strategy. Campaign events became part political rally, part constitutional seminar. At a packed auditorium in Tyler, Abbott explained his vision for Texas governance. "Limited government isn't just a campaign slogan, it's a way of life. When government stays in its lane, families prosper, businesses grow, and freedom flourishes." His primary opponent, Railroad Commissioner Barry Smitherman, tried to position himself as the more conservative choice. But Abbott's record spoke for itself. "Barry's a good man," Abbott would say diplomatically, "but when it comes to fighting federal overreach, I've got the battle scars to prove my commitment." The endorsements rolled in from across the conservative spectrum. Texas Right to Life, the NRA, and prominent evangelical leaders all backed Abbott. But perhaps the most significant came from outgoing Governor Rick Perry himself. "Greg Abbott isn't just my choice for governor, he's Texas's choice," Perry declared at a Houston fundraiser. "I've watched him fight for our values in courtroom after courtroom, and I know he'll fight for them in the governor's mansion." Abbott won the Republican primary with 91% of the vote, setting up a general election matchup against Democratic State Senator Wendy Davis, who had gained national attention for her abortion rights advocacy. The general election became a referendum on two different visions of Texas. Davis represented the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, advocating for expanded social programs, and greater federal involvement in education and healthcare. Abbott stood firmly for limited government, traditional values, and Texas independence. This election is about whether Texas will remain Texas. Abbott said during their first debate at the University of Texas, "My opponent wants to turn us into California. I want to keep us as the place where freedom and opportunity go hand in hand." The contrast was stark, and Texas voters responded decisively. On election night, Abbott won by 20 percentage points, carrying to 135 of 250 for counties and winning the largest share of the Hispanic vote for a Republican gubernatorial candidate. In decades, Victory Party organizer Jim Franklin watched Abbott's acceptance speech with amazement. "I've been to a lot of political events, but I've never seen anything like this. Greg didn't just win an election, he led a movement." Abbott's victory speech that night would be remembered as the moment when Texas conservatism found its voice. For the 21st century, tonight, we didn't just win an election, we affirmed that the Texas spirit of independence and self-reliance is alive and well. We proved that when you trust the people, defend the Constitution, and stand up for what's right, victory is not just possible, it's inevitable. As Abbott was sworn in as the 48th governor of Texas, on January 20, 2015, he stood before a crowd of 10,000 supporters on the steps of the state Capitol. The man who had been paralyzed by a falling tree 30 years earlier was now the most powerful political figure in America's second-largest state. "My fellow Texans," he began, his voice carrying across the Capitol grounds, "today we begin a new chapter in the greatest story ever told, the story of Texas. We will govern with wisdom, lead with courage, and never forget that our authority comes not from government, but from the people who trusted us with their sacred vote." The transformation was complete. Greg Abbott had evolved from a small-town lawyer to the champion of conservative values not just in Texas, but across America. His journey from courthouse to governor's mansion had been marked by unwavering principle, strategic brilliance, and an unshakable faith in the Constitution and the people of Texas. August 25, 2017, began like any other summer day in Austin, with temperatures climbing toward triple digits and the familiar hum of air conditioners working overtime across the city. But Governor Greg Abbott knew this was no ordinary day. Hurricane Harvey, a category 4 monster with winds exceeding 130 miles per hour, was bearing down on the Texas coast with unprecedented fury. In the State Operations Center, a high-tech command hub buried deep beneath the Capitol complex, Abbott rolled his wheelchair up to the massive wall of monitors displaying satellite imagery, weather data, and emergency response coordinates. The room buzzed with controlled urgency as meteorologists, emergency management officials, and National Guard commanders prepared for what could be the worst natural disaster in Texas history. "Folks, let me be clear about something," Abbott addressed the assembled team, his voice cutting through the tension. "This storm is gonna test everything we believe about Texas resilience. But I've learned something in my years of public service. It's not the size of the challenge that matters, it's the size of the response. And Texas has never backed down from a fight." Chief of Staff Louise Seens had worked with Abbott for over a decade and recognized the steely determination in his voice. "Governor, the latest models show Harvey potentially stalling over Houston for days. We could be looking at catastrophic flooding across the entire Gulf Coast region." Abbott nodded grimly. "Then we better make sure every resource the state has is ready to deploy. I want the National Guard activated, search and rescue teams staged, and shelters open from Beaumont to San Antonio. And Louise, I want to be on the ground with our people. If Texans are gonna weather this storm, their governor's gonna weather it with them." The next 72 hours would define Abbott's legacy as a crisis leader as Harvey made landfall near Rockport, bringing with it a 12-foot storm surge and winds that flattened entire neighborhoods. Abbott was already en route to the impact zone in a specially equipped vehicle convoy, standing in the ruins of what had been downtown Rockport, with debris scattered like matchsticks and the acrid smell of destruction hanging in the humid air. Abbott addressed a group of shell-shocked residents who had lost everything. "I know y'all are hurting right now," he said, his wheelchair positioned among the crowd rather than apart from it. making him physically part of their circle of loss. I know it looks like Harvey took everything from you, but let me tell you what that storm couldn't take. It couldn't take your Texas spirit, your neighbor helping neighbor heart, and your faith that tomorrow's gonna be better than today. An elderly woman named Martha Gonzalez, whose family had lived in Rockport for generations, stepped forward. "Governor Abbott, my house is gone. My business is gone. How are we supposed to rebuild from this?" Abbott reached out and took her weathered hand in his. "Ma'am, I want you to remember something. 33 years ago, I was lying in a hospital bed, doctors telling me I'd never walk again. Everything I thought my life was gonna be got washed away in an instant, just like your house. But you know what I learned? Sometimes the Lord tears things down so He can build them back better and stronger." The crowd grew quiet, hanging on every word. Texas didn't become the greatest state in the Union by giving up when things got tough. We became great because when life knocked us down, we got back up, dusted ourselves off, and got to work. That's exactly what we're gonna do here. As Harvey continued its destructive path toward Houston, bringing with it unprecedented rainfall that would eventually total over 60 inches in some areas, Abbott transformed the governor's office into a 24/7 crisis command center. He slept in his office, taking catnaps between briefings, press conferences, and deployment decisions. Houston Mayor Sylvester Turner called Abbott at 3 a.m. on August 27th. As the city began to flood catastrophically. "Governor, we've got thousands of people trapped in their homes. The bayou system is completely overwhelmed, and we're looking at water levels nobody's ever seen before." "Sylvester, I've already activated every high water rescue vehicle in the state," Abbott replied, his voice hoarse from days of constant communication. "Coast Guard helicopters are in the air. National Guard boats are deploying, and I've requested federal assistance. But here's what I need from you. I need you to tell your people that help is coming. Tell them that Texas doesn't leave anybody behind." The images that emerged from Houston over the following days would become iconic symbols of both devastation and heroism. Ordinary Texans with boats, jet skis, and even air mattresses launched impromptu rescue operations, pulling neighbors from flooded homes. The Cajun Navy, volunteer rescuers from Louisiana, poured across state lines to help. And through it all, Abbott's steady leadership provided a calm center in the storm. At a press conference on August 30th, with downtown Houston still partially submerged behind him, Abbott delivered what many consider his finest moment as governor. "Folks, I've seen a lot of things in my years of public service, but I've never seen anything like what I've witnessed these past few days. Not the destruction, though that's been heartbreaking. What I've seen is the very best of the Texas spirit." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "I've seen neighbors who don't even speak the same language working together to save each other's families. I've seen folks who lost everything still volunteering to help others. I've seen proof that when you build a society on faith, family, and community, no storm, no matter how fierce, can wash away what really matters." CNN's Anderson Cooper, broadcasting live from Houston, would later say, "I've covered disasters around the world, but I've never seen a governor more present, more engaged, or more genuinely connected to the people he serves than Greg Abbott during Harvey." The recovery effort would take years and cost billions, but Abbott's handling of the crisis elevated him from regional political figure to national conservative hero. His combination of competent government response and inspirational leadership provided a model for conservative governance under pressure. At the one-year anniversary memorial service in Rockport, Martha Gonzalez, whose rebuilt home now sat on the same lot where her old one had been destroyed, sought out Governor Abbott. "Governor, you remember what you told me that day after the storm?" she asked, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Yes, ma'am, I do," Abbott replied. "Well, you were right. The Lord did build us back better and stronger, and having you lead us through it, that made all the difference." Abbott would carry the lessons of Harvey with him through every subsequent crisis, understanding that true leadership isn't measured in fair weather, but in how you stand with your people when the storms of life threaten to overwhelm everything they hold dear. March 2020 brought an invisible enemy to Texas. That would test Governor Greg Abbott's conservative principles in ways Hurricane Harvey never could. COVID-19 didn't announce itself with satellite imagery and storm surge warnings. It crept silently through communities, carried in handshakes and hugs, turning the basic human connections that define Texas culture into potential threats. In the governor's conference room, epidemiologist Dr. Jennifer Williams spread charts and graphs across the mahogany table, while Abbott studied the data with characteristic intensity. The numbers were stark: cases doubling every few days, hospital systems beginning to strain, and economic activity grinding to a halt as fear gripped the nation. "Governor, we're looking at potentially catastrophic scenarios if this virus spreads." Unchecked, Dr. Williams explained, pointing to projected infection curves. Other states are implementing lockdown orders, closing businesses, restricting movement. The federal guidelines recommend. Abbott held up his hand, his expression thoughtful but determined. "Doc, I appreciate the science, and I take this threat seriously, but I need you to understand something. Texas isn't other states. We don't govern through fear, and we sure don't suspend constitutional rights because Washington tells us to. We're gonna find a Texas solution to this problem." Chief of Staff Louis Scenes recognized the familiar tone. Abbott was about to chart a course that would put Texas at odds with the prevailing national narrative. "Governor, the media's gonna hammer us if we don't follow the same playbook as New York and California." "Luis, since when do we care what the media thinks?" Abbott replied with a slight smile. "Our job isn't to make CNN happy. Our job is to protect Texans' health and their freedom, and I believe we can do both." Abbott's approach to COVID-19 would become a defining chapter in his governorship and a model for conservative governance during crisis. Rather than implementing broad lockdowns, he chose targeted restrictions that protected the most vulnerable, while preserving economic activity and individual liberty. At his first major press conference addressing the pandemic, standing before the familiar backdrop of Texas and American flags, Abbott articulated a philosophy that would guide his entire response. "My fellow Texans, we face a serious health challenge, and we will meet it with the same resolve we've shown through every crisis in our state's history." He began, "But let me be clear, we will not allow fear to destroy the freedoms that make Texas great. We will not shut down our economy, close our churches, or lock people in their homes based on government mandates." The approach was immediately controversial. National media criticized Abbott for not following the strict lockdown model implemented in states like California and New York. Democratic leaders accused him of prioritizing politics over public health, but Abbott remained resolute. During a particularly heated press conference in April 2020, a reporter from a national network challenged Abbott's decision to allow restaurants to reopen with capacity restrictions while other states remained closed. "Governor Abbott, critics say you're putting corporate profits ahead of human lives. How do you respond to that?" Abbott's response was measured but firm. "I'd respond by saying that's a false choice created by people who don't understand how Texans live and work. A small business owner who's built something from nothing isn't motivated by corporate profits. They're motivated by feeding their family and employing their neighbors. When government shuts that down indefinitely, we're not just crushing an economy, we're crushing the human spirit." He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the intensity that marked his most passionate moments. "I trust Texans to make smart decisions about their own health and safety. I trust them to wear masks when appropriate, to maintain distance when necessary, and to stay home when they're sick. What I don't trust is government that assumes people are too stupid to govern themselves." The data would eventually vindicate much of Abbott's approach. Texas, despite its size and population density, achieved infection and mortality rates comparable to heavily locked down states, while maintaining significantly better economic performance. Small businesses that closed permanently in other states remained viable in Texas, but it was Abbott's handling of church closures that truly cemented his status as a champion of religious liberty. When federal guidelines suggested suspending in-person worship services, Abbott took a different path, meeting with religious leaders from across the state's diverse faith communities. Abbott laid out his position clearly. Pastors, ministers, Rabbis, imams, y'all know your congregations better than any bureaucrat in Austin or Washington. You know how to keep your people safe while still ministering to their spiritual needs. I'm not going to shut down houses of worship in Texas. Pastor Robert Jeffress of First Baptist Dallas, a longtime Abbott supporter, was present at that meeting. Governor Abbott understood something that a lot of politicians missed, that spiritual health is just as important as physical health, especially during times of crisis. He trusted us to do the right thing, and we did. The decision drew intense criticism from secular media and progressive politicians, but it resonated deeply with Texas's faith communities. Weekly attendance at Texas churches remained higher than in most other states. Throughout the pandemic, while COVID transmission rates in religious settings remained low due to voluntary safety measures implemented by congregations themselves, Abbott's handling of school closures followed a similar pattern. While many states kept schools closed for entire academic years, Abbott worked to reopen Texas schools as quickly as safely possible, arguing that children's educational and emotional development couldn't be indefinitely suspended. Education is the great equalizer in American society, Abbott said during a back-to-school event in Dallas. When we keep kids out of school for months on end, we're not just disrupting their learning, we're disrupting their futures, and the kids who suffer most are the ones who can least afford it. By the summer of 2021, as other states began to lift restrictions they had maintained for over a year, Abbott made a characteristically bold decision. On March 2, 2021, he announced the complete lifting of the state mask mandate and the reopening of all businesses at full capacity. It is now time to open Texas 100%, Abbott declared at a Lubbock restaurant surrounded by cheering business owners and workers. Everybody who wants to work should have the chance to do so. Every business that wants to be open should be open. The decision was immediately dubbed Neanderthal thinking by President Biden, but Abbott embraced the criticism as validation of his approach. When the President of the United States calls Texans Neanderthals for believing in freedom and personal responsibility, that tells you everything you need to know about how out of touch Washington has become. Abbott responded, "We'll take being called names over being told how to live by politicians who don't understand Texas values." The COVID-19 pandemic tested every assumption about the role of government in American life. In Texas, under Abbott's leadership, the state proved that it was possible to take public health seriously while refusing to sacrifice constitutional rights on the altar of bureaucratic mandates. The approach wouldn't just influence policy in Texas, it would provide a blueprint for conservative governance that would inspire leaders across the nation. As the immediate crisis passed, Abbott reflected on the lessons learned during one of the most challenging periods of his governorship. COVID taught us that the choice between freedom and safety is often a false choice. When you trust people to make responsible decisions, when you provide them with accurate information without mandating their behavior, you can achieve both. That's the Texas way, and it served us well. By the winter of 2023, Greg Abbott had transformed from a regional political figure into something unprecedented in modern American politics, a sitting governor whose influence extended far beyond state lines, whose policy decisions were studied and replicated by conservative leaders nationwide, and whose name was whispered in Washington corridors as a future president. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It was the culmination of nearly 3 decades of consistent conservative governance, principled stands against federal overreach, and an uncanny ability to articulate complex constitutional principles in language that resonated with ordinary Americans. In his Capitol office, surrounded by memorabilia from his legal career, family photos, and a worn copy of the Constitution that had belonged to his father, Abbott met with a delegation of Republican governors from across the nation. They had come to Austin not as peers seeking advice, but as students learning from a master. "Greg, what you've accomplished here in Texas has become the gold standard for conservative governance," said Governor Ron Wilson of Alabama, leaning forward in his chair. "The way you handled COVID, your border security initiatives, your defense of religious liberty, it's exactly what Republicans need to be doing nationwide." Abbott's response was characteristically humble but confident. Fellas, I appreciate that, but what we've done in Texas isn't magic. It's just common sense applied consistently. When you trust people instead of government, when you follow the Constitution instead of polling data, and when you remember that our rights come from God instead of politicians, good things happen. The gathering of governors was just one example of Abbott's growing influence within the national conservative movement. His policy innovations had become templates for Republican-led states across the country. The Texas Heartbeat Law, which effectively banned most abortions after 6 weeks, had been copied by over a dozen states. His border security measures, including the controversial decision to bus migrants to sanctuary cities, had forced a national conversation about immigration policy. But it was Abbott's handling of cultural issues that truly elevated him to icon status among conservative Christians. His signing of legislation protecting parental rights in education, defending women's sports from transgender participation, and prohibiting gender transition procedures for minors had made him a hero to millions of Americans who felt their values were under assault. At the annual Conservative Political Action Conference (CPAC) in February 2024, Abbott received a reception typically reserved for presidential candidates. The standing ovation began before he reached the podium and continued for nearly 5 minutes as delegates chanted, "Abbott, Abbott, Abbott, my friends." Abbott began, his voice carrying easily across the packed auditorium. "They tell me that Texas conservatism has gone national. Well, I've got news for them. It's about time." The crowd erupted again, but Abbott raised his hand for quiet. "You see, what they call Texas conservatism is really just American conservatism applied without apology. It's the belief that government exists to protect our rights, not grant them. It's the understanding that freedom isn't free, and that each generation must fight to preserve it for the next." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the audience. "Most importantly, it's the recognition that we are not just citizens of states or even of a nation. We are children of Almighty God, endowed by our Creator with rights that no government can take away." The speech, which lasted nearly an hour, covered everything from economic policy to foreign affairs. But it was Abbott's closing remarks that would be replayed on conservative media for weeks afterward. The question facing America today isn't whether we'll remain a great nation. It's whether we'll remain a free nation. The choice isn't between Republican and Democrat. It's between liberty and tyranny. And as long as Texas has anything to say about it, liberty will win. Behind the scenes, Abbott's political team was already fielding calls from major donors and political operatives about a potential presidential campaign. Campaign consultant Mary Catherine Patterson, who had worked with Abbott since his attorney General days, watched the CPAC speech from backstage. "I've managed a lot of political careers, but I've never seen anything like this," she confided to Deputy Chief of Staff James Mitchell. "He's not just popular with the base, he's inspired them. They don't just want to vote for him, they wanted to follow him." The speculation about Abbott's presidential ambitions reached fever pitch following his decisive re-election as governor in 2022. Despite facing a well-funded Democratic challenger in Beto O'Rourke, Abbott won by the largest margin of any Texas gubernatorial candidate in over 2 decades, capturing not just rural counties, but making significant inroads in suburban areas that had been trending purple. On election night, addressing a crowd of thousands at the Austin Convention Center, Abbott delivered what many observers considered a victory speech with national implications. "Tonight, Texas sent a message that will be heard from sea to shining sea," Abbott declared, his family standing behind him on the stage. "We sent a message that constitutional conservatism isn't just alive, it's thriving. We sent a message that when you stand up for what's right, the people will stand with you." The crowd chanted for more years, but Abbott held up his hand with a knowing smile. "For more years as your governor, absolutely. But let me tell you something, the fight for freedom doesn't end at the Texas border. The principles we've defended here, the values we've upheld, the Constitution we've preserved, that's America's fight, and it's just getting started." By early 2024, Abbott for President groups had formed in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. While the governor remained officially uncommitted to a presidential run, His schedule increasingly resembled that of a candidate, with trips to early primary states, meetings with national media, and speeches to conservative groups across the country. During a private dinner at the governor's mansion with longtime supporters, Abbott reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. "You know, when I was lying in that hospital bed 40 years ago, I thought my life was over. I couldn't have imagined that God had a plan that would lead me here." His wife Cecilia, who had been by his side through every triumph and challenge, smiled. "Greg, I think that tree fell for a reason. Maybe the Lord knew Texas was going to need a governor who understood that real strength comes from overcoming adversity, not avoiding it." Abbott nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe so. All I know is that every challenge we've faced, from Harvey to COVID to the border crisis, has prepared us for whatever comes next, and whatever that is, we'll face it the same way we always have, with faith, with courage, and with an unshakable belief that America's best days are still ahead." As the sun set over Austin, casting long shadows across the Capitol grounds, Greg Abbott had become something unique in American politics, a leader who had never compromised his principles for political gain, never wavered in his defense of constitutional government, and never forgotten that his authority came not from his office, but from the people who had trusted him with their sacred vote. Whether his future lay in Austin or Washington, one thing was certain: Greg Abbott had become more than just a governor. He had become the living embodiment of conservative principles applied with compassion, constitutional government exercised with wisdom, and Christian faith lived out in public service. The boy from Wichita Falls who had learned about duty and faith at his father's knee. The young lawyer who had seen his life forever changed by a falling tree. The judge who had defended constitutional principles. The attorney general who had fought federal overreach. And the governor who had led Texas through crisis after crisis had become something unprecedented. An icon of the American conservative movement and a symbol of hope for millions who believed that liberty, properly understood and courageously defended, could still light the way forward for the greatest nation on earth.